The room I remember most clearly is not the room where it happened. It is the room before it. A small bedroom on the upper floor of my parents' farmhouse in southern Manitoba, about 40 minutes east of a town most people have never heard of, set back from a gravel road that goes gray and vanishes in both directions into flat land and sky. Early November, the kind of cold that comes off the prairie without warning or apology, pressing against the window glass hours before the sun rises, my wedding dress hanging from the hook on the back of the door. Plain, dark green, the color our community required for a bride's dress, sewn by my mother's hands on the same machine her mother had used. Because in an old colony Mennonite home, there is no closet built for ceremony. There is no unveiling, no bridesmaids, no rehearsal, no moment of theater before the thing itself. There is only the dress on the hook and the morning coming faster than you are prepared for it. I am 19 years old. My mother is somewhere downstairs. I can hear the women moving through the kitchen, the low percussion of dishes, voices speaking in low German in that particular register a house takes on when it is full of people who have gathered to witness something they will not discuss directly afterward. Not at dinner, not ever. The sound of community folding around an occasion. And I am standing in front of the small oval mirror above the washstand, the only mirror permitted in the house, kept there for practical purposes only, so that a person can check their appearance before meeting the world. And I am doing what my husband-to-be has already done twice in the weeks preceding this morning. I am inspecting myself. I am looking at what he looked at. I am trying to see what he saw. Before I tell you what I mean by that, let me tell you who I am. My name is Clara. I grew up in an old colony Mennonite settlement in southern Manitoba, and I left that community when I was 26 years old. This channel, Clara Plain and Simple, is the place where I finally say the things my community would never have permitted me to say out loud, where I try to find the words for the things that were handed to me without words and carried in silence for years before I had the language to set them down. If any part of what you are hearing is unfamiliar to you, if you are watching this because you want to understand what life looks like from inside a community most people only see from the outside, please subscribe right now and hit the like button and leave me a comment below, telling me, did you know this practice existed? Because in my experience, almost no one outside communities like the one I grew up in has ever heard of it. And almost no one inside them has ever spoken of it above the lowest possible register of a voice. Now let me explain what I mean when I say my husband-to-be inspected me. And I use that word with precision and intention. In the old colony Mennonite community where I was raised, marriage is not a private arrangement between two individuals who have come to know one another and chosen each other by their own measure. It is a covenant between families, ratified by the church, structured and governed by what the older generations called simply the Ordnung, the unwritten but absolute code of conduct that organizes everything in daily life. The Ordnung is not a document. That is precisely the point of it. It does not exist in writing because writing would make it visible, debatable, fixable. Instead, it lives in the shared understanding of the community, transmitted not through instruction, but through watching and correction and accumulated knowing, through the slow deposit of what is done and what is never done, year after year, generation folding into generation, without the record ever being made explicit. And one of the things that is known, has always been known, is that a man who is seriously considering marriage to a woman was permitted, in our community and in several of the more conservative settlements nearby, to conduct what the older women referred to simply as a review. It had no formal name that I ever heard. It was not announced from the front of the church, not discussed in any teaching I received as a child or a young woman. It appeared nowhere in anything written down, but it existed the way many things in that world existed, known by everyone who needed to know it, spoken of by no one in any direct way. When my mother told me it would happen, She did not present it as unusual. She explained it the way she explained most things that required me to do something difficult or uncomfortable. Briefly, practically, in the tone she reserved for information that was simply factual and not subject to discussion. This is how it is done, Clara. These things are not ours to question. I was 18 when she told me. Eli and I had been in courtship for just over 4 months. He was 23. He worked his family's grain operation on land that had been in their family for 3 generations, and he had a reputation in our district for being steady, unhurried, fair in his dealings. He paid what he owed without needing to be asked twice. He was the kind of man the older men pointed to when they wanted to illustrate something. Eli had spoken to my father about proceeding toward marriage. My father had agreed, and then, a few days later, my mother came to find me in the garden where I was staking the last of the season's tomato plants, and she told me what came next. A man considering marriage, she explained, standing there on the other side of the tomato stakes with her hands folded in her apron, was given 1 or sometimes 2 opportunities to review his intended. The community's purpose in this, as it was understood, was to confirm suitability, to establish that the woman was healthy, physically capable of the work of marriage and children and a farm household, that there were no hidden conditions or weaknesses the bride's family might have concealed in their desire to finalize the match. It was framed in everything my mother said and didn't say as a practical matter, a matter of fairness to both families. I asked whether Eli would be in the room. She said yes. I asked whether I would be alone with him. She said no. She herself would be present, and also an older woman from our congregation, a woman who held no formal position, who had no title, but who was understood by everyone in the settlement to function as a kind of midwife and advisor and keeper of knowledge, the person you went to when something needed to be assessed or resolved, and the church elders could not be the ones to do it. She would be there as the third party, the one who knew how these things were supposed to proceed. I asked my mother what he would be looking for, and this is the moment I have returned to more than almost any other in the years since, the moment her expression changed. I did not have words for what moved across her face then. I have them now. It was the expression of a woman who has spent her entire life accepting something she was never once given permission to question, and who feels, in the moment when she must pass that acceptance on to her daughter, the accumulated weight of every woman who carried it before her. A weight so old and so familiar that it had long since stopped feeling like weight and only felt like the air in the room. She felt it in that instant because I asked, because I made it visible by asking. She said, "He will want to see that you are well." That is all she said. The first review took place on a Wednesday evening in late October, about 3 weeks before my father and Eli's father settled on a wedding date. I was brought into the front room of our farmhouse at an hour when my father and my brothers had been sent outside to see about something in the equipment shed, the way men are sent outside when something is happening inside that requires them to be elsewhere. The older woman, who I will call Esther because that is not her name, was already seated near the window when I came in. Her hands were folded in her lap. She had the composure of someone who has performed the same task many times and finds nothing irregular in its performance. She might have been waiting for a church service to begin. Eli came in a few minutes later. He greeted my mother. He did not greet me directly, not with his eyes. He looked at me the way a man looks at a parcel of land he is seriously considering purchasing, methodical, quiet, unhurried. His gaze moved without self-consciousness because in the understanding his community had provided him, as surely as mine had provided me with mine, this was not a moment that called for self-consciousness. This was practicality. This was a responsible man doing a responsible thing. Esther spoke first. She asked me to stand straight. She asked me to turn slowly, all the way around. She asked me to extend my hands, palms facing upward, so that Eli could look at them. She asked him whether he had questions. He did. He asked about the health history of my mother's family, whether there had been any patterns of weakness or illness among the women, whether I had experienced any serious sickness in recent years. My mother answered most of his questions. I stood with my hands out, my palms open to the ceiling. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I was feeling, because I have had years of therapy and a great deal of time outside of therapy to understand it at different distances, from different angles, and I know that the understanding shifts depending on where I am standing when I look back at it. At the time, I was not angry. I was not frightened, not exactly. I had been prepared for it. I had been told what to expect. I had been told it was normal. And in my community, it was. And something happens to a person when they are told that a difficult thing is simply normal, especially when they have been told so since childhood, not in words, but in everything surrounding them, in the texture of daily life, in what is never questioned, in the way adults move through certain moments without any expression that would suggest the moment is unusual. You do not experience the thing as wrong. You experience it as the shape of the world, as weather, as gravity, as what is. The feeling beneath it, the one without a name, the one that comes later and arrives slowly, was something I could not identify for another 8 years. What I felt standing in that front room with my palms open was this. I was something being evaluated, not someone being known. Esther guided the review with the efficiency of a person entirely at ease in her role. She did not appear to find anything uncomfortable about what she was doing. She spoke to Eli with calm authority, noting what she observed, offering her assessment of my health and constitution in the same tone my mother used when she talked about the garden after a good season. Good constitution, strong frame, clear eyes, steady hands, good color. She'll manage well. Those were not her exact words, but they were close enough that I can still hear the register of them, the brisk and practical warmth of them, the absence in them of anything that understood me as the subject of the sentence rather than its object. Eli nodded. He thanked my father, who had come back inside by then. He did not thank me or speak to me or look at me again in the way I had become accustomed to during courtship. He put on his coat and left. The older women gathered briefly in the kitchen, and I could hear them speaking through the door, low and even, and I could not make out the words. I stood alone in the front room for a moment, and I looked at my hands, the ones I had held out for him. And then I went upstairs and I made my already made bed, smoothing and re-smoothing the quilt, just to have something to do with my hands. The second review took place 9 days later. My mother told me the night before. She said Eli had a few additional questions. She said Esther would be present again. She said it would be shorter than the first time. She was right that it was shorter. It was not shorter in the way I had hoped. There is a part of this that I cannot describe in full here, because this platform has limits I have learned precisely, and I will not exceed them. What I will say is this. When the second review was finished, Esther said 4 words to my mother in a tone that was not intended for me, but was entirely audible to me, because I was standing less than an arm's length away. She said, "She'll do well. She'll do well." As though I were a field that had been assessed for what it might produce. I am telling you this because most people who are watching this right now have never heard of this practice, and I think that matters. Not because I want to shock anyone, but because the thing about practices like this one is that they persist, in part because no one outside them knows to ask about them. If something in what you've heard so far sounds like something you've experienced, or something someone you love has described to you, please leave me a comment. You don't have to say anything specific. You can just say you hear me. And subscribe if you want to keep listening, because there's more to this story, and I intend to keep telling it. After I left our community at 26, I found a therapist, an English woman. That is what we called everyone outside. The English, regardless of where they were actually from, who had spent years working with people, who had left high-control religious communities. She had heard many things in that office over many years. She did not react to difficult disclosures with the kind of shock that makes you feel you have to manage the listener's response on top of your own. When I described both reviews to her in the full detail I cannot offer here, she was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then she asked me a question I have thought about nearly every day since she asked it. She said, "At any point during either of those reviews, did anyone ask you how you were feeling?" I had to think about it. I turned it over carefully. I thought about my mother's face when she'd told me what was coming. I thought about Esther's composed efficiency. I thought about Eli's assessing eyes, moving without embarrassment. I thought about my father shaking Eli's hand at the kitchen table afterward. I thought about the sound of the women's voices on the other side of the closed door. "No," I said. "No." No one asked. My therapist was quiet again for a moment, and then she said, "That is not incidental to the practice. That is the practice." She meant that the absence of any inquiry about my feelings was not an oversight. It was not that everyone in those rooms had simply forgotten to ask. It was that my internal experience of the reviews was not considered to be relevant information. What mattered was Eli's assessment. What mattered was Esther's verification. What mattered was the two families' satisfaction with the outcome. My body was the subject under examination. But my interior life, what I felt in those moments, what I feared, what I needed, what was happening to the part of me that was not my hands or my constitution or my frame, that had never been part of the equation. It was not designed to be. It never had been. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Miriam. Miriam came from a settlement about 60 kilometers from where I grew up, one that was somewhat more conservative than my own in its practices. We met years after we had both left. She had left before me by about 3 years, at a small informal gathering of women who had come out of similar backgrounds and were, each in our own way, trying to sort through what we had carried out with us. We had never met before that evening, but we recognized each other almost immediately, in the particular way that people recognize each other when they have survived not just the same general difficulty, but the same specific shape of it, the same contour, the same room. Miriam had been reviewed 3 times before her wedding. 3. Her intended husband's family had requested a 3rd review after the 2nd one, because there had been, in their words, a concern that had arisen. Miriam was never told what the concern was. She was only told that she needed to present herself again. She did. Afterward, the concern was declared resolved. The wedding proceeded on the original schedule. She told me this the way she told me many things that evening, steadily, with a composure I recognized as the particular kind that takes years to develop, the kind that allows a person to speak about certain things without falling apart while speaking about them. She was not falling apart, but her hands were very still in her lap, the kind of stillness that comes from holding oneself together with considerable care. I asked, "How old were you?" She said, 17 for the first 2, 18 for the 3rd. We sat with that for a moment without speaking. I want to be explicit about something because the community I came from is not a single undifferentiated thing, and I think it matters to say so clearly. Mennonite is not one thing. Old Colony Mennonites are one of dozens of distinct affiliations spread across Canada and Mexico and the United States and beyond, and they vary enormously from one settlement to the next, from one decade to the next. Some of the more progressive Mennonite communities in Canadian cities are barely recognizable in terms of their practices and culture when placed alongside the settlement where I grew up. In the General Conference Mennonite churches, in the Mennonite Church Canada congregations in Winnipeg and Saskatoon, marriage preparation looks almost entirely unlike what I have described here. The practice I am describing is specific to the more conservative, more isolated, more tightly governed settlements where the ordnung is maintained not through documents or formal discussion, but through tradition alone, through the accumulated weight of what has always been done being passed from one generation to the next without being examined. In those places, the review practice, or versions of it, persists, not because anyone stands up and defends it openly, but because the ordning requires no defense. It requires only maintenance, and it is maintained the same way all such things are maintained, through silence, through the unquestioned assumption that what has always been done must continue to be done, through the brief practical tone in which difficult information passes from mother to daughter, in a way that forecloses the daughter's ability to ask why. I married Eli. The wedding was on a Thursday in November. The service lasted nearly 4 hours. The minister spoke at length about yielding, about submission, about the wife who submits herself to her husband as the congregation submits to the will of God. I stood in my dark green dress in front of 300 people, and I listened. And I thought about the front room, about my palms open in the lamplight, about Esther's voice saying, "She'll do well." And I thought, I have already been submitted. Before this dress, before these vows, before this day. The submission did not begin here. It had already been established by the time I arrived at this moment. The wedding was the confirmation of something the review had already decided. Our marriage lasted 7 years. I will not say it was without love. I do not think I would be serving the truth if I said that. Eli was not a cruel man. He was not violent. He was not, by the standards of the world he had been given, a bad husband. He did not understand, I believe, at any point during those reviews or after them, that anything about what he had done was wrong. The framework he had been handed told him that what he did was careful and responsible, the action of a man who took his obligations seriously and wanted to enter marriage with his eyes open. His community had given him that framework as surely as mine had given me my silence. That is the thing I have sat with the longest in all the years since leaving. Not anger at him individually, though that was present in the early years, but something colder and more structural than personal anger. Anger at a system that handed a 23-year-old man a permission he had no reason to question, and handed a 19-year-old woman a silence she did not know she was allowed to break. Those two facts, his permission and my silence, were not accidents or individual failures. They were the design. They were what the Ordnung, unwritten and unexamined, produced when it needed a marriage to happen. When I left, the shunning came quickly. Letters that went unanswered. Phone calls that rang through to silence. My mother, once, staying on the line long enough to say, "I will pray for you, Clara." And then the click. I have returned to that click many times in the years since. I have sat with it late at night and tried to hear in it something other than what it was. I have listened for ambivalence in it, for reluctance, for the sound of a woman who is choosing the community over her daughter because she cannot conceive of any other way, and not because she does not love the daughter. I have tried to hear love in the click. Some days I think I can. Other days I only hear the click. In therapy, I was given words that my community had never given me permission to use for my own experience. Bodily autonomy. Consent. The difference between choosing to yield and having something taken without anyone acknowledging the taking. I learned that understanding what happened to you, naming it, putting specific language around it, is not an act of disloyalty. It is an act of honesty. And honesty was something my community valued with great consistency and sincerity in every area of life, with a single carved-out exception. Anything that might disturb the order of things. Honesty that kept the order was virtue. Honesty that questioned the order was something else, something the community did not have a word for except, perhaps, trouble. I learned in therapy that I had spent the first 26 years of my life metabolizing other people's frameworks as though they were my own. The work of leaving was not just physical. It was not just the logistics of departure, where to go, how to live, how to navigate a world I had been largely insulated from. The work of leaving was learning to notice the moments when I was experiencing the world through someone else's framework and asking whether the framework fit. Often it did not. Often what I found when I looked directly at the thing was that the framework had never been built with room for me inside it. Not for what I felt, not for what I needed, not for the part of me that had been standing in that front room with her palms open, watching a man's eyes move over her and knowing somewhere beneath the trained acceptance, in a part of herself she had not yet learned to listen to, that something about this was not what it had been presented as. There is a girl I think about often, whose name I don't know. I saw her once at a barn auction when I was 17, before my own reviews, before I had any idea what was coming for me. She was standing a little apart from the other women at the auction, off to the side of the long tables where the equipment was laid out, watching the crowd with an expression I could not interpret at 17. I have the vocabulary for that expression now. She looked like someone who had recently discovered that the world was constructed in a way she had not been told about, that the ground she had trusted was not where she had believed it to be. There was something in her face that was not yet grief and not yet anger, but was the moment just before one or both of those, the moment of recognition, of realizing that what you were told was the whole story was not, in fact, the whole story. I know that look from the inside now. If you grew up in a closed community, any community, not only mine, where your body was assessed before anyone thought to ask what you were experiencing, I see you. If you were handed a silence and told it was modesty or propriety or simply how things were done, I see you. If you stood in a room with your palms open and held them steady and still because you had been raised to understand that this was the shape of the world, that this was simply what happened next, and there was a small and wordless part of you, very small, very quiet, buried under years of being told this was normal, that knew something was not what it was presented as, but you had no language for it and no permission to speak it, I see you. You were not wrong. You were never wrong. You were given a framework too small to hold you, and when you felt the edges of it pressing in, when you stood in that room and felt something you couldn't name, you were not being defiant or ungrateful or faithless. You were a person responding honestly to something your community had decided your response to did not matter. The mistake was the framework. It was never you. I think about that girl at the auction sometimes, and I wonder where she is now. I wonder if she found her way to a place where someone finally thought to ask. I wonder if she found words. I wonder if she found what I have found slowly, imperfectly, with a lot of help from a quiet office and a therapist who was patient enough to wait for the real answers, that the world can be other than the way you were raised to believe it had to be, that the Ordnung, unwritten as it is still something that was made by people, and what people make can be examined, what people make can be questioned, what people make can, in the right circumstances, be set down. I set it down. It cost me everything I grew up with. I won't pretend otherwise. But what I have now, the language, the space, the ability to ask how I feel and believe the answer is relevant, I would not give it back. I am Clara, and this is what plain life looks like from the inside of it, told plainly for the first time.